This is a good moment to start the recording, actually. You want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start.
All right.
Mr. Econoboi.
Mr. Jangles. Do people know your real name?
Yes, my real name is Justin.
Justin. Okay, I got you. Mr. Justin Jangles, Science Lab. I don't know if that's first of your name?
First of my name,
Okay.
House of
That's
Lads.
good. Well, I was going to ask, so you went to school for kinesiology, a well-known field.
Very well-known field, yes.
Yes. Why?
Much more widely known as exercise science.
Why'd you choose kinesiology?
Almost on a whim. So I went to school pre-med first. I was going to be a doctor.
Okay.
And
as
then,
many of us did.
As many of us did. And then a year into it, I took my first biology course, and I was thinking, like, okay, so if I don't get into med school, if it turns out, that's not what I want to do, what can I do with a bachelor's degree in biology? And one of the big things is, there's biology labs you could look in. You could work for. And during my first semester in biology lab, I realized I would rather take my own teeth out with pliers than ever have to do another goddamn biology lab ever again. So I was like, okay, so what can I do with the credits I have so far? And I just lost like a lot of weight. I was really into bodybuilding. So like, okay, so what's it called if you like want to like do exercise and stuff? I didn't even know what kinesiology was. Prior, like up to like a week before changing my major, I did not know what kinesiology was. And yeah, the rest is history. I was a personal trainer for 10 years.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. And I guess you decided to go to grad school and everything. When did you meet your husband?
I met my husband just after graduating, like the summer I graduated.
Okay, so this was peak bodybuilding Jangles.
Yeah, when I was actually in good shape. And then then I got into powerlifting, and you can get fat in powerlifting. And then I stopped being a powerlifter, but I kept eating like a powerlifter, and then I just got regular fat. But by the time that happened, it was too late for my husband.
All right. I assume you've never been accused of being a soy boy by the sounds of it.
No, all the time.
Oh, well, so that's ridiculous. You powerlifter, bodybuilder guy, exercise individual. I don't know what to call it.
Exercise. Come on. Yeah, well, you wouldn't know from looking at me now, but that's going to change soon.
Ah, I see. Okay. Well, one interesting question. I remember when I was talking to there was a guy at my university who ran the recreation and wellness center at the university that I went to, and basically the gym. And I asked him once. I said, do you feel like because you're a person who is in the recreation and wellness industry, because you run a gym at a college, do you feel a particular pressure to remain in good shape? And he actually said he did feel that he was under a unique pressure to remain in good shape because of the industry he's in. Do you feel the same pressure?
Yep, it's one of the reasons I kind of like went away from personal training to more towards teaching. So a bunch of like life stuff was happening. Wasn't keeping up with diet. Wasn't keeping up with workouts as like I used to. And I started getting. When you wear sweatpants to work, it's often harder. It's often hard to feel yourself getting chubbier. So yeah, kind of looked down one day like, oh, I do not have the body that I used to. Luckily, most of my clients were like in their 50s and 60s, and I was like training people with like stroke survivors and people in wheelchairs and old people. So they didn't care. They were there for beach bodies. That made it a lot easier.
Okay, and that makes sense. Just people trying to get out of the house and put in some work.
The way I like to put it is, I trained people who they want to be able to walk to the mailbox on their last day on Earth.
Okay, I see. I see. I imagine that's a unique challenge, training a kind of an older person versus just a younger, out of shape person.
Yeah, I thought it was way more rewarding. Like training someone to like get six pack, like I guess that's fine. But training someone who like wants to be able to stand up if they fall, that's actually rewarding. Like my best, most proudest moment is I had a stroke survivor who walked with a cane and had to like get picked up off the road one day because he was walking by himself and he couldn't get up. Best moment is like him being able to like ditch the cane and actually stand back up. Like that was
Mm.
way better than getting someone a six pack.
Yeah, that makes sense. Obviously, because that's more, I guess, functional, right? Whereas a six pack is purely aesthetic, right? I guess. Well, obviously, you're in good shape when you've got a six pack, but it's
Maybe,
you
yeah.
know, you can be in good shape without a six pack, though. The six pack itself is like,
It's
let's
nice. I'm
look at
not
the six
knocking
pack.
six packs. They're
That's
nice,
fair.
but
You know,
not everything.
of course, famously, we all have a six pack. It's just the how much layers we have in between the outside world and our six pack. That's the difference.
Yeah, a six pack doesn't mean you're in good shape. It means you're skinny.
That's fair. That's fair. Six packs on skinny guys do not count. That's what they say. And you know, given my body composition, I tend to agree. So that's my thought. But so I remember watching your. I was first exposed, I think, to your content. It was when you released your basically trans women in sports video. I don't recall the exact title.
Well,
And
that's basically it. Yeah.
yeah, and it kind of went around the sort of the it went around in the sort of politics Twitch sort of community, and as a fairly transformative video, I think it shaped a lot of people's views on trans women in sports, especially when addressing the issue. It was very timely because it seemed like I don't know if you kind of saw the news picking up in that regard. You decided to release, or it was kind of a coincidence, but right when all this kind of trans women in sports stuff was kicking up, that's when your video came out, and of course, it was the best video that I'd seen on the topic. And I was telling someone that I go back and I actually watch that video. I don't ever debate trans issues. And I'm an economics guy, obviously, on YouTube for the most part. So it just doesn't come up. Not that I wouldn't do it. Um, but I find myself, because your video was so good, I find myself coming back and watching it. And sometimes I'll think to myself, oh, I wonder if this video has like 2 or 3 million views at this point, right? Because I always assume it's way more viral than it was because it's such a good video, right?
Oh,
I assume that
yeah, I
a
appreciate
million
it.
or 2 million people watched it. Um, so
And no, nah,
yeah,
not even
it's
close.
surprising because like even like a similar situation like economics, unlearning economics. He had that viral breadtube economics video, which you might not be familiar with, but
Oh yeah.
that video sort of, that video sort of sparked him to get essentially where like 70% of the way to where he is now. Basically, is that one video that sort of took the rounds and went from there. And your videos maybe are arguably on a more niche issue, which is similarly quality, I think. And so with regard to your degree, I would assume this is not a topic that you're really taught about in courses. Rather, just the tools that you learned in your courses equipped you to answer the question
Right, the
after the
research
fact.
is pretty slow coming up on this. Now, I intentionally, so one of my grad courses was an advanced level, grad level exercise physiology course. And for my final project, I specifically looked at sex differences in sport because I wanted to incorporate. By then, I was already like doing YouTube stuff and already like well versed on trans issues, and I thought, okay, this is a good opportunity to make me sit down and look at what research has been done here. And turns out, not a lot. And so a lot of it is speculative. Seems like speculative is not the right word because there is a ton of research into how hormones affect performance. There is a ton of it. It's just never like trans specific. Like you wouldn't find a lot of the relevant papers if you searched transgender on Google Scholar, for example. But you can find a lot of it if you know what to look for. If you like cross search like endocrinology, testosterone suppression, stuff like that. There has been a lot of research on that, and I thought that was really, really valuable. It's also why a pretty bad paper by Hilton and Lundberg was able to gain all that much traction, like because their paper was bad. It was
Right.
not
It's just the first thing that comes up.
right. It's the first thing that comes up, and of course, like since it was one of the first major papers on that exact topic, especially if it was done by people who might not have had the most noble of intentions. That's why it made the rounds so quick. And that's why I wanted to because I was already doing work on that on a video because my master's degree in biomechanics is just kind of gathering dust on the wall behind me. So I had to get some use out of it. And so as I was already doing research on it, and then I was made aware of this paper, I was like, you know what? It's as a framing device and as something that's going to help me focus more and like have better points to address. I'm going to make the video a response to this paper to make use of all the sources I did. And I had almost as many sources in that YouTube video as I did in my like master's thesis. So a lot of work
Yeah.
went into it. It is not the most entertaining video. Might be why it's not doing numbers. It is not a very entertaining video, but I stand by all the research I did up to the point where for a while I was in contact with someone to actually turn it into an actual paper, which would be cool, right?
Well, so that's an interesting question. So after making, I don't recall how old this video is. It maybe 6 or 12 months or something.
Something like that. Yeah. I don't either. Time is meaningless. I have no concept of time anymore.
Yeah, COVID has definitely skewed my ability to recognize the days going by. But when it comes to that video, so an interesting thing is I've experienced this a little bit with my I do scripted content as well, and it just debates are a bit easier, and discussions like these are a bit easier to produce. And so, rather than going 2 months without a video, I try to do stuff like this to supplement from there. But my scripted content is really sort of the maybe the where I started, right, doing videos and about economics. And an interesting question is, this has happened to me, not to any significant degree. Like I've never, at this point, I'm lucky to say that I've yet to release a scripted video and been completely wrong on a topic, right? So that's always embarrassing if that were to
Yeah.
ever happen. Um, but I've learned more things that if I could remake those videos, I'd probably add to them, or I might be more nuanced here and there. Have you learned anything since releasing that video? I guess one thing is, what's the position you take in the video for the audience in terms of trans women in sports, in the female category of sport? And then have you learned anything that has added to your perspective since releasing that video?
So the perspective I take in the video, which is still what I stand behind, is that I do think that especially like trans women ought, in order to compete as women, ought to undergo some sort of hormone replacement therapy, hormone blockers, some sort of like endocrine therapy to level the playing field. Because obviously there are huge sex differences in all areas of performance between natal men and natal women. That's a terrible word, but it's what's used in literature. So there's a ton of differences there, but the main driver of those differences is hormones. So we don't separate men and women because men are bigger and stronger. We separate men and women because men are pound for pound bigger and stronger. So that's the main reason why we separate those categories. Like we don't have height categories in any sort of sport, even though height can be an advantage, because it's just not. It doesn't reach that level of like importance to separate people. Like so, you don't have a short league in basketball because you can still compete to a certain degree. So, and depending on the sport, because all sport is not the same. Depending on the sports, would imply like different time frames and different protocols for what they would need. So for an endurance sport, a pure endurance sport, so we're talking like marathon running, long distance swimming, long distance cycling, things of that nature, 6 to 12 months is enough. Like hemoglobin levels drop to typical like female levels. And like the muscles themselves kind of change their physiology to where they're on par with one another. For team sports, which are usually a mix of strength and endurance, 1 to 2 years, which is typically what the ILC recommends anyway. And then beyond that, for like combat sports, where power is the biggest separation. It's not just strength, it's not endurance, it's power. That's the biggest separation. So it requires the longest time frame of trying to attenuate these differences. And so that's like 2 to 3 years.
Okay, and that makes sense. And I think what's your general view on, I guess, well, I guess the second part of the question I'd love you to answer is, have you learned anything since releasing that video that has maybe added to your perspective, or do you think fundamentally that video is as encompassing today as it was when you originally released it?
There's obviously like more nuanced, I don't even want to say nuanced, more information I could cram into it. But in terms of like any meaningful thing, anything meaningful that I've learned, no, not really. Just because like, there are things that I wish I could put in that video. I can't think of any off the top of my head because none of them like jump out as like, oh, I definitely got this wrong, or oh, I definitely fucked up here and should have mentioned this. Because like I have this 12 years of research behind me, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been a lot of meaningful research to come out specifically on the topic since. So
Yeah, and that makes sense. I guess, like you said, there's a bit of a glut in the sort of systemic review side, but also just the actual, specifically any experimental designs in this regard as well. That are at least reasonable enough. Obviously, it can be a difficult thing to study. So I remember this is a tough issue to talk with people about because um, there is an understandable natural intuition that it just doesn't make sense. The idea that trans women would compete in the women's category, right?
right.
So one thing that can be difficult to argue about is like, um, who I'm sure you know the name. Who was the power lifter from New Zealand that was Olympic qualified? Um,
Laurel Hubbard.
so Laura Hubbard. This is an example where people would, for people that don't know, Laura Hubbard, I believe, is she's actually rather old. I think she's in her 40s, I
Right.
think, and qualified for the Olympic trials. And I believe did actually compete at the Olympics with the New Zealand national team.
Yep.
And
With the
naturally, when people, yeah, when people look at this, the natural inclination, a lot of videos I see is, wow, look at this man who's competing against these women in these powerlifting events. But of course, what people neglect to mention is she came in dead last.
she
Like she
bombed
did
out.
terribly at the Olympics.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
like
bombing
uh,
out in powerlifting or in Olympic weightlifting is when you don't make a lift. Like so, you get 3 attempts in both sports. You get 3 attempts to register a lift, and typically what you'll do is you'll set a nice safe number so you don't bomb out. And she didn't do that. Apparently, she didn't do that, or she thought she set a
yeah,
safe number and she just didn't get the lift. And the eventual winner. So the first thing you do is the snatch, which is a one full motion from the ground over your head. So she bombed out, and the eventual winner of that, the weightlifter from China, nailed it. But that exact same weight. So
yeah, and I think that, I mean, to be fair though, I think that like Laura, but those examples I think are difficult to argue because for all of sort of human sporting history, I guess we've either had only men competing or we've had men and women's categories that I can think of. I mean, I'm sure there's some sports that mix the genders together. I can't really
they're
think of
few and
any.
far between, and it's usually like there's something there.
Yeah, like even I mean even chess has a gendered category, which probably doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. But even
Yeah,
even something like chess has a gendered category,
it
right?
is very
Um,
ingrained into the public psyche, especially when you're talking about sport. Yeah, yeah, and I get what you're saying. It is
yeah,
very like intuitively, it's hard for a lot of people to reconcile, but it's also hard to intuitively understand the effects that hormones would have on your body because most of us aren't exposed to exogenous hormones, hormones that our body doesn't naturally produce. So most of us wouldn't be aware of the enormous effects. In fact, I think the only thing in the public mind, what happens when you take exogenous hormones, is like anabolic steroid use. That's the only thing that would register in most people's mind. And yeah, that has enormous effect, and that in and of itself has enormous effects. If you take extra testosterone, your performance goes through the roof because that is the main thing driving performance in most sports. Obviously, not for like uh, long distance running, but for any sport that involves power, any sport where more muscle would be beneficial, anabolic steroid use is like shoots your performance through the roof. But a lot of people aren't going to be nearly as familiar with like the opposite. What happens if you take testosterone blockers and if you take external estrogen? It's a lot harder to put in someone's mind because it's not as familiar to people. It might be more familiar in the future, like as we get more and more cases, more and more trans women competing, trans girls competing. It will become more familiar, but for right now, it's a very strange beast that goes against what your intuition says, and I think that's why a lot of people on the right wing are pushing it so hard. Because like it's we had like a trial run for trans issues with gay issues. A lot of the same arguments are being recycled. And we kind of have a playbook. Like, yeah, we want to respect everybody. We love freedom. People can identify how they want to. That's familiar to people, even if they don't necessarily agree. But with sports, that doesn't hit the same like level. That doesn't hit the same intuition that something like just you can live however you want. And so that's why it's being pushed so hard. It's why it's being like thrown to the forefront because they think that's the easiest win.
yeah, I think so, and I think well, there's also circumstances where I guess even you would say there's probably some unfair advantage going on, right? So there's like news stories about I remember it was a long time ago. There was a news story about a track athlete who was a trans woman but was not on any sort of regimen like you're describing, and people would naturally say, it's the same thing. Oh, this is a man competing in track against women, and of course there's videos of like this person just dominating the other women in the competition because they're not on any sort of schedule. So I guess from your perspective, but
From
you
my
would make that
perspective,
argument that
yeah, from my perspective, that actually does constitute an unfair advantage in sport. It would be the same as there are men who produce like what is considered like a way higher levels of testosterone, and their body doesn't like start to get numb to it. Uh, I think what's his name? Ed, fuck, I forgot his name. One of the most famous powerlifters of all time.
oh you'd have to answer that question yourself. I'm a big strongman fan, but not powerlifting.
Yeah, Ed Cohn. Ed Cohn? Yes, Ed Cohn. Ed Cohn was actually banned from a lot of powerlifting meets because his testosterone levels were just way too high. And he
Oh,
maintains that he
okay.
never doped, but his testosterone levels were like naturally too high. It's why we actually need some better parameters than just testosterone levels. Like there needs to be a little bit more. If you're going to take a scientific approach to it, there needs to be a little bit more nuance than that. But yeah, I would consider that is just there's a natural thing that is happening that is still so far outside what the norm would be for most people in the sport that it there are reasonable things that like maybe don't do that. Like for example, I don't think anybody over the who is more than 250 pounds or more than like one standard deviation above like a normal weight should be competing in middle school football. Like I that's another thing that I would say, even though it's natural, I would still say it poses a risk to the other players, or it poses an unfair
I see.
advantage. Yeah, something like that.
Like if you've hit puberty early, basically, and you're like
And you're a
a
full
young
like
man going against boys.
yeah. I remember
Yeah.
going to a middle school football game when I was like watching a cousin play, and there was this kid who was like 250 pounds who tackled someone who was 120 pounds. 120 pounds. That's not a small middle schooler. And ended up really, really hurting him. And my first thought was, there's no fucking way that kid should be on the field. I don't care if it's natural or not. That poses a risk. So to me, that
Yeah.
would be a somewhat equivalent thing. I do think that there ought to be after, after puberty or like a year or so after puberty is reasonably expected to begin. I do think like in order to compete, we should have some sort of like hormone regimen or blocking regimen, which hopefully as trans healthcare becomes more widespread and more accepted, hopefully we get to see more of that.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I think I saw you hopped on to maybe a call-in segment with Lauren Southern at one point.
Mm-hmm.
How did that go?
You know what? I think a day before or a day after that, I put out a video that I'd spent like months working on, and then I went on a call with Lauren Southern for 15 minutes, and the Lauren Southern call got like 10 times the views. It's like
Yes.
yeah. So
Yeah.
Lauren Southern was having a Q&A debate, and I kind of let her have dealer's choice. Do you want to talk about trans affirmative healthcare, or do you want to talk about trans women in sport? And she went with the trans women in sport because it seems like an easier topic to get a W on. And yeah, a lot of people make assumptions that aren't necessarily like, it doesn't like hold up. Like a lot of people say stuff about like pelvis width as if that's a thing that really matters in sport.
Yeah, that's a bit of an odd. I mean, I think anybody, anybody being honest would obviously say there's average physiological differences between assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth people,
Mm-hmm.
right? Of course, it's really just a matter of like what you're saying. Can't after an exogenous treatment of hormone replacement or some sort of hormone blocking treatment, are those physiological advantages changed? And the ones and those physiological differences that remain, are they even relevant? So you mentioned pelvis difference. I think in your video you make the point that like people talk about bone density, but by
Yeah.
the same logic, you wouldn't. It's like black women have on average higher bone density than white men, but like, would you say black women would outcompete white men on average in sport? Probably not.
Yeah, it
That
turns
doesn't
out
really
like
make sense.
bones don't move by themselves. So they're not a force producing tissue. And so it is a big difference. It is something that's there, and I think, but just because that difference is there doesn't mean it's meaningful or impactful in the scenario that we're talking about. Yeah, maybe in terms of like a risk of osteoporosis for non-athletic populations, maybe that's worth talking about. Then, yeah, that's a valid difference that we should incorporate in sport. With healthy people who are already going to have higher bone density than the average person, like, do you have enough bone density to withstand the forces in your sport? That's kind of all you need. More is not going to offer an advantage.
Right, and that makes sense. Okay, so I think to put a pin on that issue, I think it's to me, based on your video, based on the research that I've been able to engage with, essentially there is some protocol that we can standardize that hasn't been standardized quite yet, but there is some protocol out there that confers essentially no advantage to a trans woman if they compete in women's sports. And it's really more a matter of not should they be able to compete in women's categories in general, but rather what is the protocol that we can all agree on, such that basically the advantages conferred to trans women are no different than any advantage conferred by being born with like a natural, like you said, a naturally higher testosterone rate or something like that. Like obviously, you can't perfectly even out the differences in talent and skill, but that's not your goal in sports. Your goal is just, do you have an inherent advantage or not? And that's what you try
Yeah,
to equalize.
and that's where the discussion gets really interesting, because what does it mean to have an inherent advantage, or an advantage that's not
Unfair
inherent?
advantage.
Unfair advantage,
Yeah.
and that gets tough. Like, what does it mean to have an unfair advantage? Like, if you grew up, with rich parents who could afford, rich trainers and had access to the best facilities and the best nutrition and the best trainers and all that stuff, is not an unfair advantage? That gets a little bit tough. But I know what you're saying. So what I think is really interesting is that 10 animals per liter. That's like the testosterone limits that designates you as being able to compete in women's sports. That was not made for trans women. And a lot of people will. I've seen a lot of like trainers say like 10 animals per liter is way higher than the average woman. The average woman is like 2 nanomoles per liter of testosterone. That's way higher. Well, that protocol wasn't put there for trans women. That protocol was put there for cis women. That protocol it goes back way farther than trans women, and it was because designating what is a woman in terms of like athletic capabilities, that's actually a lot tougher. Like, you can't just do it by genitals, you can't just do it by chromosomes, you can't just do it by there's a lot more to it than that, because it turns out in this context sex is not binary. So yeah, you have to have a little bit more a scientific approach to it, and that's why I think we do need to update the protocols, and we do need to like be more specific, especially like when talking about what sport are we talking about. Like a long distance swimmer is not going to have the same like changes to their body with the same level and same regimen. So we need to like make those protocols be more sport specific. But the fact that we've already had trouble with before trans women shows that like this is not a new thing. This is not a new problem that the existence of trans people has been introducing into the field of sports science.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. I think that's a decent enough way to round that one out. The next issue I wanted to speak to you about. I don't know if you've done a video on this, honestly, but I'm sure it's an issue you've probably looked into quite a lot. Is the idea of trans affirming healthcare, especially for young kids, right? So, very controversial topic, especially nowadays, since it seems like conservatives kind of agreed. All right, we lost on the gay rights thing. We're going to move on to another group that we can marginalize. This time we've, used to be black people, then it was gay people. Now we're going to go with trans people, right? And so this is the wedge issue, trans affirming healthcare for youths. And
You got to put the
so
youths in there. That's how you sell
yeah.
it. Like, oh wait, okay, so how do we square the circle of we want freedom, we want everyone to be able to do what they want, but also we don't actually want that. Oh, think of the children.
Think of the
That
children. Well, yeah, and so, and to be fair, look, I think of the children is a
it's a fine
I
thing to
understand
think
where,
about.
yeah, I understand exactly, and so, and it's an interesting question. The idea of, you know, if a child is experiencing gender dysphoria, how do we understand and treat that? And um, what are the protocols with regard to that sort of transforming healthcare? And should it even be allowed? So, for instance, I think that um, I want to say the UK recently basically got rid of trans affirming healthcare for people under the age of, like, you can't be on puberty blockers unless you're 16, which is almost like
De-
just not
depending
being
on
able
when you
to,
hit it,
you
like
know,
that could be like
yeah, I
5 years
mean,
after puberty starts.
yeah, I imagine most people have actually hit puberty by the age of 16. I'm not sure of the statistics on that, but um, so that's kind of an odd regulation. And this question of, like, should doctors have relative autonomy to prescribe treatments is an interesting question. This is the abortion argument of, like, there's not a right to an abortion in the Constitution. There's a right to privacy between you and your doctor. And if your doctor prescribes, or facilitates you having an abortion, that's where your right to get that procedure done comes in. That the government doesn't necessarily have the right to say that you're not allowed to have, that sort of a service between you and your doctor, because the government would be invading your right to privacy between you and your doctor. And I think a similar argument can be made with trans affirming healthcare. What are your general thoughts on trans affirming healthcare for, you know, basically prepubescent children, like young children under the age of, say 12? What's your reading of the literature? What do you think?
So obviously, it does get a lot tougher when you're talking about kids because that notion of informed consent is up like the top of the hierarchy in terms of importance in medicine. And with kids, like it's not a bad thing to say that kids aren't able to give informed consent to the capacity that adults can do. And so when you do, but on the flip side of things, you still have to treat kids. You still have to treat both mental and physical problems that they're having. So, and that makes it hard to do research because any like new research, especially regarding like mental problems like gender dysphoria, I don't want to call it a mental problem, but you know what I mean. It gets tougher to like conduct experiments, for example, because people say you're experimenting on children. Well, yeah, that's how medical studies are conducted. You have to conduct experiments, and so just before, like it was like a day or two ago, the biggest study, so yeah, it came out on December 14th, so it came out 2 days ago. The biggest study on trans-affirming healthcare for children came out. So association of gender-affirming hormone therapy with depression, thoughts of suicide, and attempted suicide among transgender and non-binary youth. So they looked at, it was the best designed study and the largest study of its type. It took a survey. It involved almost 12,000 trans or non-binary youth. And they looked at, okay, what is gender-affirming hormone therapy? How does that work? How is this effective at alleviating the things that we want it to alleviate? And they found that, yeah, it wasn't even close. So they found that parent support for their child's gender identity had a strong relationship with the receipt of it, and the receipt of gender-affirming hormone therapy was associated with a much lower odds of depression, much lower suicide attempts, and much lower considerations of suicide. This is very, very effective on that broad scale. So we have enough evidence to say, and this is not the first study that come out of its type, but it is the best, and it's kind of confirming what the research was already pointing towards, that a gender-affirming treatment, including hormone therapy, is the most scientifically and empirically supported way forward for someone who is, for a kid who is diagnosed with gender dysphoria. It is the best way to go forward. Now, there can be there's always individual exceptions, and that's what kind of like, you'll hear individual stories of detransitioners, and and they do deserve to be taken seriously. They do deserve to be like heard, and we ought to be somewhat careful in the same way that you would with any treatment, right? You wouldn't just throw a kid on, well, hopefully you wouldn't just throw a kid on antidepressants after talking with them for 10 minutes. So there should be a good medical process there, but the fact of the matter is we're not experimenting on kids. We're treating them. There's way too much empirical evidence. There's way too much scientific and clinical research to say that gender affirming care helps trans kids with gender dysphoria. It absolutely helps them. And so now it's a matter of how can we fine tune this to make it more individual, to get doctors. one, to get doctors even more education on this specific area, like maybe offer more courses on it in schools and medical schools for clinicians who want to specialize in this area, and two, we need to make sure that there are enough clinics so where like they're not overrun and they're not trying to just churn out as many patients as possible. So we need more resources into this area to help all the problems that the transphobes are afraid of. We need more resources pumped into this area, not fewer, which is what the
Yeah, and
UK did.
that's interesting because at least by my reading of the political landscape, it seems like the trans sports thing has become a way more regular part of the debate than like trans affirming healthcare. Now, to a certain extent, this is a good thing. To a certain extent, well, we'd rather not be stigmatizing trans women in sports,
Yeah.
right? Um, but I haven't seen a similar push in America, even in the most conservative states, to ban trans, affirming healthcare for younger people. Have you seen any of that? Maybe I just haven't read as much on it.
It's always, you should always assume I'm ignorant before anything else. But I haven't seen, most of what I see is coming from the UK. And that's usually what the most egregious stuff that I'm seeing. Maybe it
That's
overshadows.
weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, they call it Turf Island. I don't. Why? What? That's so weird that there does seem to be this. I don't know what it must be a cultural thing. Clearly, I don't know why it is. For instance, if we look at I saw an interesting map which compared the statewide abortion rules in America versus the countrywide abortion rules in Europe, and I was actually surprised to find that um, the U.S. is one of the most liberally applied countries in terms of your right to get an abortion relative to European countries. I was shocked to see that actually.
Yeah,
And
doesn't fit with
if you
intuition.
look Well, yeah, and if you look at drug laws, there's many countries in Northern Europe and Western Europe have way harsher drug laws even than the United States does. Interestingly enough, that on a federal level, yes, we are still a prohibition, country in terms of marijuana, but um, the bulk of our population lives in either a decriminalized marijuana area or a legalized marijuana area, right? Which those things were interesting to see that some of the more liberal sort of live and let live kind of thing is still to a certain extent a real thing in America. I suppose relative to some European countries, which I thought was interesting. But what is your response when I think the standard response from this point in the conversation when speaking to someone against gender affirming healthcare is okay, whatever. Right, I get it. The whatever you got some studies that says that gender affirming healthcare for younger people works. Okay, well, what if some crazy leftist parent wants their kids to just be trans because they want to be different, and all of a sudden you've got this kid that's forced onto this treatment that doesn't even actually want it. I know what my standard response would be, but what would your response be?
I'd say like the same approach would apply. Like making a kid go against what their gender identity is, forcing them to like behave in ways that make them uncomfortable. That's just as bad. If it's a cis kid and you're forcing them to be trans, that's no less egregious, no less harmful than the opposite way around. In fact, one of the main stories that they bring up, there's like John, I think it was John Monet. A lot of tourists will like to bring him up because he's the originator of the blank slate of gender identity and all gender is socially constructed. There's nothing biological. Well, there was this kid who had a botched circumcision, and this doctor came and said, "Hey, all right, let's get rid of all of it. Raise him as a girl." Raise him as a girl, and because there's nothing in the brain about gender. It's all everyone's a blank slate. Just raise him as a girl, and he'll be fine. And no, he wasn't fine. He had gender dysphoria. Like he had what would inarguably be called gender dysphoria because he was being raised as a gender identity that did not align with what was in his head. And so like he had a lot of mental problems. He had a very, very similar life path as a lot of trans people who are denied trans affirmative health care. So no, like that's bad. The point is like get someone to live their best life in accordance with their gender identity, no matter what that is.
Well, but Jangles, the crazy doctors are just going to prescribe this treatment because the parents are also crazy, and that's how these kids are going to be forced onto this treatment that they don't need.
Okay, what if they do need it? See, that's the thing. Like, I'm not great at arguing against that. It's like, well, dog, you're not talking about trans healthcare anymore. You're talking about healthcare. This is a problem with every single profession, every single like interaction when you take your kid to the doctor. Like, oh, this fucking crazy ass doctor wants my kid on allergy medicine. Oh, well, no, fuck that. Allergies make him stronger. If I just shove his face in some more pollen, he'll get used to it. It'll get tougher. Like, I don't know. I actually don't know how to respond to that. And that, which is kind of, it's almost it's frustrating and a little disheartening that like you would hope that there's some trust in the medical establishment. There's gonna be some disagreements on individual like cases, but at a certain point, like, dog, being a doctor's tough. Takes a lot of education. Takes a lot of knowledge of research that us dickheads on the internet aren't gonna have access to. So no, I don't think your 20 minutes of Googling and your Facebook group knows more than the entire medical profession.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think my response that I would add to that is just to say that it's not like the easiest thing in the world to get this type of care in the first place, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you typically have to have multiple referrals. You oftentimes have to demonstrate gender dysphoria over the course in a child over the course of several years, right? That this has been a persistent issue. And it's not just like, oh, my son. I once saw my son wear my wife's dress once. Like this is a gender dysphoria isn't just doing things that would traditionally be considered feminine or masculine, but you're the opposite based on your assignment at birth. It's more that, gender dysphoria is like a persistent mental ailment that is affecting your day to day life. Like, this is why being trans isn't a mental illness, but gender dysphoria is, because not every person who's trans has gender dysphoria to any extent, but also to the extent that it might be detrimentally affecting their day to day life. Right. And, that to me, that would be my response as well. It's like,
This perception of like your kid wakes up one day, decides, hey, I actually like pink clothes more than I like blue clothes. So hop to it. Take me, get my hormones.
And then the psychiatrists are going to be.
Yeah, psychiatrists see like, oh, you like wearing pink. Well, guess what? It has like 9 needles.
So. Yeah, exactly. That's ridiculous. So I don't think anybody's advocating for that anyway. Obviously, I think that doctors are like, we've had problems with doctors prescribing things that people didn't need in the past. Sure, right, but that's less a reason to get the politicians involved and more a reason for the medical field to sort of work its way through and under a safe regulatory framework, right?
Yeah, overprescription of opioids. The solution to that is not, okay, no more pain medicine for anybody. It's not the solution.
Yeah. Or like you have to be over this age to get pain medicine, or you have to, anything like that. It was.
Yeah, it's like, oh shit. Well, you better hope you don't get hurt or have pain before you're 18, right? Like, no, there has to be.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah, and so stuff like that, I think these are some odd arguments, because ultimately I think that we like the goal is not to have some leftist takeover of academia, which of course is a consistent conspiracy on the conservative space. But the goal is more so just there's 1% of 1% of kids that have an issue like this that is detrimental to their long-term health, to such an extent that it leads to many of them having suicidal ideation, committing suicide, being stigmatized throughout their lives. And there's seemingly more and more evidence coming out by the year that seems to affirm the idea that this treatment is what you want in order to prevent those types of things, right? To get these kids to have stable lives.
Well, they would say that there's been an explosion of people who are suddenly developing gender dysphoria in the past like decade. 3,000% increase, which sounds like a lot until you like look at what the original number was. It's like, yeah, 3,000% of 100. That is a 3,000% increase, but it's not numerically all that much. Which, yeah, of course, it's been more accepted. It's like awareness of this thing that you can do has gone up. We also have a lot more younger kids, and like Gen Z and younger. We also have a lot more of them identifying as something other than straight. That's not a bad thing. In fact, if this was like being what I always want to ask is if it's so biologically ingrained, like you're either a man or a woman, and that's incredibly biologically ingrained, and so is your sexuality. Right? You can trick kids into being gay, all right, but their natural inclination is to be straight. Okay, so why does just letting them know that the option is there? Why is that enough? It seems like if something is so biologically ingrained, just a part of our DNA, to be so fundamental to what it is to be a human, it seems like it would take more than just offering up the option in order to subvert that, subvert that, like, deep-seated programming.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, it's similar to saying, we've had seemingly the rates of people reporting depression and anxiety have increased over time in the modern world, right? But
Right.
I don't think naturally we would say like, this is because the media establishment and the liberal establishment is being over accepting and causing people to become more depressed and have anxiety. It's like, well, no, it's probably part of it is that as society develops and becomes wealthier, you can focus, that hierarchy of needs shifts around, right? And that, people working in coal mines probably simply do not have the time or the money to focus on their mental health, right? And so, as societies become wealthier, it's not surprising that they might, start reporting and feeling less stigmatized about their mental health. I mean, it's like when people say like, African villagers have less depression than like the average, middle class American. And it's like, yeah, I, but that doesn't mean the African villagers are more well off,
It's
right?
like, well,
It
one,
probably
yeah,
just
where are they
means,
getting their diagnosis? Or like
yeah,
it's
exactly.
a it's a
So,
it's a
yeah,
combination of, like, yeah, there are life circumstances, but I think an equal part of it is like we're just we understand more that, like, no, being really really like down, not just sad, but like there's a certain, like, state of mind, a certain it's not a mood, it is just your state of being that persists for months or years. I think we have a more understanding that no, that's actually not normal. That's and it's worth getting checked out. It's important to get checked out because people have been depressed for as long as, like, people have been alive. It's just, how does that manifest itself? A lot of, like, when we talk about, like, mental health research, a big problem, because we frame mental health the same as we do, like, physical health, in the sense that, like, a broken leg is going to manifest itself the same way in society today as it would have manifested itself 10,000 years ago in the woods foraging for food. Like, a broken leg is going to look and feel and function pretty similarly. But with mental health, it's a lot different. It's a lot harder to make that one-to-one connection to the past. So I had a discussion like a little over a week ago. Someone with what we would consider today to be bipolar disorder. That ailment might not have manifested itself the same way back then. Same with, like, something like ADHD. That might not have manifested itself in the same way, like in the woods, like divorced from, like, a modern civilization. And so that's the whole concept behind, like, medicalization. I know Foucault was a little kind of creepy, but he did have a good observation that, like, medicalization, that process of, like, saying that no, this thing is outside the norm, and more importantly, it's negatively impacting your ability to interact with the world around you. It's negatively impacting your ability to be a member of society. That's how we inform. That's what medicalization means. We have designated something to be a medical ailment, and there can be some insidious stuff there, but it's also, like, really really relevant. Like, how, at what point do you care about your depression? Oh, when it starts interfering with your life, when it starts, like, impacting your work performance or your relationship with your significant other or something that is important to you, it starts impacting that, and that might be what motivates you to go get help. So I don't think it's a bad way to look at things, and that makes things a lot tougher. Like, another thing that's brought up, this is brought up among, like, trans people and, like, trans communities. If we abolished the concept of gender in society, would there be trans people? Would we have gender dysphoria? What would that look like? And I think that's an interesting thought experiment.
yeah, I'm not sure the answer to that question. I've heard that question posed before, and I don't really have a satisfactory answer right now, because if, I mean, it's sort of like asking if we got rid of the concept of an ideal body, would body dysmorphia go away, right? If sort of we had a ubiquitous culture of like, yeah, fat, skinny, buff, bulky, whatever, just do what you want, would people still have any concept of like their body not being ideal or like not where they want it to be, despite perhaps the evidence showing them otherwise.
Yeah, it's weird to say
And I
we
feel
are. Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like the answer is that yes, there still would be people like that, but that's a different issue than gender dysphoria, right? Gender, if we assume is a total social construct, if we got rid of that social construct in its entirety, I mean, is that the foundation of gender dysphoria? It's hard to say.
It is hard to say. There's a really good quote that I always like to bring up is we are biologically social. So when we talk about social constructs and something that and versus something that's innate, there's not a clear distinction there. There's not a clear separation between those two things. Um, so something that is a social construct can be just as much of your like makeup, especially your psychological makeup, and even your physiological makeup, as anything that would be otherwise considered innate. Like those two things have a lot of overlap, and you can't neatly separate them. So, for example, we do not have a lot of research on this for obvious ethical reasons, but there's a case study of a kid that was found in the woods who somehow miraculously survived. Like he had been abandoned since he was 2 or 3, and somehow miraculously survived, according to this case report from like the 1800s. And this kid had a sex drive, but not sexuality. Like he would get erections, but he would not know what he was supposed to do with them. Like he'd never seen a person before, so like he didn't know. He wasn't familiar with women or men, and he didn't know what to do with this thing. So, in a certain sense, like sexuality is a social construct in that way. But it seems so far removed to call that a social construct because, like, most of us, I'll say it, all of us listening now, we're not abandoned in the woods at the age of 2. We were raised up by people, around people, like so that's ingrained into our thought patterns, our scripts, and things of that nature. So it's hard to separate out those two things.
For sure. Yeah, there's an incredibly interesting Wikipedia article that anyone can can read. It's called it's something like list of children raised by animals or something like that. And it's a Wikipedia article of like hundreds of instances of alleged or actual documented instances of children who I for because of some circumstance or another were raised, they lived around animals and adopted they were socialized by animals, right? And it categorizes it like people raised by monkeys, people raised by wolves, people raised by, alligators, whatever the circumstance might be. And it's it's interesting because in the most well documented versions of those cases, of children who are raised by animals, obviously they're documented because they eventually were separated from that environment. They always ubiquitously struggle to basically become like a socialized human being at that point. And it's really interesting because you'd assume like, yeah, if you were raised by wolves until you were 10 and then you were taken in by like an adoption agency, you're going to eventually learn how to speak and you're going to learn how to do math and you're going to be, it might take you longer because you started at 10 instead of 5 and you were raised by wolves instead of humans for those 10 years, but you're going to eventually be a socialized person. Um, the answer is apparently that that is almost impossible to do and it's very, very difficult. An interesting case was a guy who was raised by wolves in India and he lived amongst wolves and is a very similar situation. He eventually got found, put in an adoption agency. He never was able to learn how to talk and he was what we would consider he was developmentally disabled. Like he wasn't really able to learn similarly to other children or other adults. And that's a very bizarre reality because you know what I mean? Because it's almost like your socialization itself can cause you to not be able to learn or develop uh, amongst other. Like, there's no innate ability of humans to learn and do those things. Is essentially what that seems to prove out, which is a really interesting almost scary reality
Yeah, it
for
is
a lot
very
of people.
important when you're talking about most issues in society, especially if you're talking about like group differences. Now, socialization happens it almost immediately. Like children will develop. To bring it back to this topic, children will develop a sense of gender by the time they're 2 or 3. It's one of the first major lenses that we all like learn to view the world through. So this is a lens that we are socialized with early on. Um, is that innate? I don't know. If you don't grow up around people uh, and you don't learn this, well, then it's not innate, is it? So yeah, it's. I think that's super interesting. It's the only bad part about it is because there's so much nuance. It's almost like, well, why talk about social constructs at all if social constructs are basically everything? Like I hate it when
Well,
people say that
I
social constructs mean that like, oh, it's meaningless and arbitrary. Like no, it's not. They're so ingrained that like
no, that's
they're
what I'm saying.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really important, and I think it's important for a lot of arguments. So it's crucial, I think, for the argument of uh people who are homosexual or not hetero, sort of traditional, people in that regard, um because naturally, like you said earlier, people would say, oh, it's a choice, you're just trying to be different and stuff like this, and it's like, well, no, like, on one hand, there's the people who think being gay is genetic, right, which that seems to have fallen out of favor as an explanation for people being gay, and more so what's come into play is like, um it's probably part of your socialization at a very, very young age, right? That this is why when you ask like the average gay person or the average non-hetero person, when did you realize you weren't straight? Typically, the answer isn't I was like 28. No, like typically you start to develop that kind of thought and feelings when you're very young, and go from there.
Yeah, there's
And
no yeah.
that's
There's no
I mean, because
single go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, because kids, because when you're 8, you typically don't have much of a conception of sex and sexuality, right? At least like the average 8-year-old, right? But a lot of people who are gay, who are not straight, start to say that's when they started having those feelings when they were very, very young. And so, how do you bridge that gap without saying it's clearly socialization and environmental to a large degree?
It all depends on like so one of the theories that has been put forth and it's I haven't updated I haven't oddly enough I actually haven't done a ton of research on gay issues, which is weird. Um but one of the theories brought forth is that like a environment in the womb like exposed to like more or less masculinizing or feminizing hormones can have an effect on that. Like if you consider that like an environment, I don't know. In terms of like genetics, there doesn't appear to be a gay gene, but on the flip side of that, like nothing we do isn't a result of our genes. Like every single human behavior, thoughts, proclivity, what have you, can come down to genes. It's just a matter of like, can you say like, oh, this gene's what causes you to be gay, or this gene's what causes you to be, have a certain kink or something like that. Well, no, it's usually not how genes work. There's usually it's multifactorial, and we can have different genes manifesting themselves in different ways in different environments. It could result in like the same outcome, which in this case would be being gay. Um, so and also it's like what options are available to you. It might be that like humans are way more bisexual or pansexual than we originally thought because I've heard that sex feels good. Maybe I'll have it one day to make sure. But I've heard
Yeah,
sex is pretty neat, and maybe having it with
I've
like
heard the same.
yeah, I've heard like so maybe having it with more than one type of person could just be a natural like inclination towards the human experience that all of us would like to do. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting topic. I need to go get a drink of water and pee real quick. Okay,
All right.
I'll be right
A
back.
brief commercial break.
Brief commercial break. Alrighty.
All right. Yeah, I think to finish out this topic, I think the last implication of the the socialization is so important. Like I think the feral children thing is a good. It's actually a good response to the idea, because a lot of people will say that um a lot of people will say that black people are genetically predisposed to like crime or less intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the feral children thing is a decent argument against that, because again, like the by all accounts, these were perfectly healthy children who just happened by some reason or another to be placed in a an animalistic environment, right? And they ended up basically acting and becoming animals, right? That they weren't able to speak like regular people. They weren't able to. Their whole entire learning process was different. Now, obviously, black people are not animals, right? But when we look at like the predisposition to do crime and stuff like that, or perhaps a lack of an ability to do well relative to your peers in school, I think that clearly there's like the explainers there aren't genetic, right? The explainers there are clearly there have been systemic problems with regard to the government's relationship with this community and the societal relationship with this community, stigmatization and ostracization that clearly caused these kids to have less opportunity and less resource available to them. Like, obviously there's a reason why the rich white kid in the nice part of town gets a better SAT score than the poor black kid in the bad part of town, right? There's obviously clear resource differences here, and I think something like that is a good
Yeah, it's
explainer of as to those issues.
it's tough to explain to a lot of people that like when you talk about something like systemic racism, it's not just everybody's being racist all the time. It's like circumstances that trickle down to like someone who is discriminated against, like a long time ago, like objectively everyone would agree that they're discriminated against, are going to have the same opportunities, and therefore their life circumstances are going to be of a poorer quality, and they're going to have kids in that poorer quality environment, and those kids in that environment are from the get-go going to be disadvantaged in terms of like what resources are available to them, the environment they're living in shaping how they interact with the world, to be more fearful, to be more withheld, to be more quick to engage in physical force because you're exposed to a lot more, and that becomes part of your like social script. Yeah, like it's not just, oh, people are racist to you in school by calling you slurs. It's everything around your environment is like incorporated into what is eventually going to be your neurobiology going forward. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. So for the second half of this conversation, I proposed. I think you mentioned as part of Kaio-san's Sunday sort of uh, what's the show called? Is it Political
Alcoholics.
Holics? Alcoholics. Okay.
Yeah.
On his Alcoholics show, you said, I'll be honest, kind of boy, I just don't know shit about economics, and it's a
True.
serious blind spot for me. And so I suppose for the second part of this conversation, I'd love to talk about economics. And I suppose, do you have an interest in economics, or do you generally, you're politically minded, of course. So do you have a general interest or sort of sense of economics in your day to day life or in your
It's
political sort of activism?
Um, so I want to say yes and no. I know that economics is incredibly important. I recognize that like it is foundational to so many other different types of issues that I care deeply about, and it's you basically cannot have an informed political opinion about 99% of issues without at least a baseline understanding of economics. On the other hand, despite the fact that I recognize that I'm the type of person who I don't check my bank account just in case there's bad news, and every credit card interaction or every like debit card interaction at the gas station is throwing caution to the wind and just releasing a hope and a prayer into the air that it's not going to ding red. So there's that disconnect between I know I should know about it, but I for whatever reason, it's never been able to stick with me. It's kind of like, and this should let you know how little I know about economics. It's kind of like if anytime someone tries to explain concepts to me, it feels like I'm stepping in on someone watching episode 647 of One Piece. And I sit down and I ask them what's going on, and then they say, "Okay," and they start explaining like every single character and their backstory and why they're important and where they are and what led them there. And it seems like I'm stepping into something that uh, I can't fathom how much I don't know. I don't know what I don't know, and there's just so much beyond what I'm prepared to like have a reasonable opinion on that I just don't bother most of the time.
That makes sense. I think some encouragement I think that I could give is that it seems like you have like the methodological tools to evaluate a lot of findings in economics, right? That if you were to research the sort of, if you were to go into the studies and stuff like that, you'd be able to grasp what they're doing. And and sort of why they're coming to it. I suppose that on the theory end, that's where it gets a little hard. Economics also, I think, is I think it's unique. Like when I was studying political science, it seemed like one of the goals of the people writing the political science papers that I was learning from was to explain their study in as simple a way as possible, right? And to be consumable by the average person. And I don't know if that's just a political science thing or maybe I just got lucky.
It should be something that all professions and fields do.
Yeah, but economics squarely does not do that,
Yeah.
right? And when you read a lot of economic studies, I think the issue is, and I have the same issue, right? Is that when you read a lot of economic studies, what you'll end up finding is that the statistical methods might make sense to you, especially if you're technically trained like you are. But then they start going into all this like what the fuck area with all the crazy modeling, and it looks like they're writing in an alien language with all the math and stuff, and it can be a lot less applied in nature. So
It's like, are you trying to
I'm
print a
sympathetic.
4D graph on paper? How am I
Yeah,
supposed to? How's my brain supposed to interpret this?
yeah, I think, and I don't know where that comes. I don't know if it's fundamentally like an insecurity of like the founders of the economics sort of research profession, but it does seem like it's almost like well, economics like science, so we got to make shit look like science, and so that's why we got all these crazy numbers and models and shit. And it's like, no, you really could just give me the statistical outputs, and I'm okay with that. You don't have to you don't have to link like the esoteric theory to your your experimental design, right? That this 10-20% of this paper is not really useful, and it serves to confuse a lot of people.
Yeah, if I could hazard a guess with economics, and is economics considered a social science?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, if I had to like hazard a guess, it's like with social sciences and like the quote unquote hard sciences. You in hard sciences you have a lot more control over your experiments. It's a lot easier to like really hone down and focus on one single variable. Whereas in social sciences, it's much more difficult to do that. Oftentimes, it's hard to conduct experiments. I mean, you basically can't conduct experiments on experiments in the sense that like you get to control every single other variable. And no, here's the only experimental variable that we're focusing on, and the only one that we're introducing into society. It's hard to account for all those other things, and so it's a lot of like working backwards and trying to infer what the best outcome would be, and that's the best you can do, and they're vitally needed. But it's a lot. I think there's that perception that even the researchers are aware of. Like, no, we got to introduce as many numbers as possible. Try to use the best statistics we can to like make the best inference possible. And it gets, I don't know, it feels like it just gets wrapped up a lot in this notion that we need to be as numerically expansive as possible, and it makes my
Yeah,
head hurt.
it can be difficult for sure. I think also economics is susceptible to um I suppose this is true in kinesiology as well. It's probably true in most any field, is that economics in my experience is susceptible to a lot of bullshittery in terms of interpretations and
Yep.
analysis of economics. So
Don't
like a
yeah.
classic analysis.
Don't think for 1 second that shit doesn't go on in hard sciences.
Yeah, I mean, like for instance, I think a standard analysis might be like, um, the economy was good under Trump, therefore Trump did a good job managing the economy. Now, I think intuitively this makes a lot of sense. Apparently, for most people, because most people would rate like Trump's handling the economy as good, right? Even after the COVID recession and all that stuff. And so it's like, okay, well, we have to unpack this because that's not true, right? We believe in markets. We're capitalists, right? For the most part in the economics professions. Um, if we believe that markets have ebb and flows, well then obviously whoever the president is doesn't just command what the economy does, right? So you might just happen to be, Bill Clinton didn't imagine the technological age starting when he was president, but it did, and the economy was good under Bill Clinton. That doesn't necessarily mean that Bill Clinton his stewardship was good or bad. It's just kind of a circumstance he was born in, right? Similar to you know, when Obama became president, the Great Recession really took hold, right? And the economy started to recede under George Bush, but it really bottomed out under Obama, and he got a lot of flack for that. It's like, okay, well, that wasn't really Barack Obama's fault, right? But of course, naturally, who do you look to in times of economic calamity? Probably the guy in charge of the government, because for one reason or another, that's kind of who we tend to look to. So it is pretty complex. If you had to say, what's like a single issue that you would say you'd want to know more about in terms of economics that you just haven't had the ability to learn about up to this point?
The part that has to do with money. Um,
Okay, how?
yeah, I know. Like, I'm not even confident that I know enough about economics to like highlight an area where is like a particular piece of interest. I guess like, all right, let's expose my ignorance to the world. I'm not 100% sure what wealth is, and why and how it's meaningfully different than income. How about that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So, well, income is easier to measure, because if you think about it, right, income is typically just defined as, the money you've made that year, right? And so you're going to file a tax return, you're going to have these inflows in your bank account if you're ever audited, and it's going to be clear to a certain extent what income you've made, right? So the dividends you've received, the capital gains you've sold, the money you've made from your job, the income you've reported is relatively easily manageable. So income inequality, right? Who's making the most income? Who's making the least income? What's the spread between these two? How much income inequality is there?
Right.
That's easy to measure. Um, Now, wealth is harder to measure because wealth is predicated on income and also inheritance for the most part. I can't think of any other components, right? So obviously, if you buy a boat, you have to use income to buy that boat. At least in a modern economy, you can't trade in a modern economy legally, right? I can't say, I'll give you 1,000 iPads for your boat. I have to convert those iPads into cash and then give the cash to you, right? So income is what is the backbone of most consumption, but also inheritance, right? If I inherited a house or a boat or a bunch of stock or a farm or something like that, um, this is what builds my wealth is income and the assets I've bought with that income and the inheritance I've got from my parents and the gifts I've gotten from people around me, stuff like that. Wealth is harder to measure because income is clear because the market does the job for you, right? You get a paycheck. The market has decided your labor is worth this. You've agreed that your labor is worth this. You get a paycheck. We already know what your income is. It's right there. The market's already sort of signaled what your labor's worth. Now, when it comes to wealth, though, um, we don't know necessarily what the value of your house is until you sell it, right? The
Right.
market is quiet until you've actually attempted to sell these assets. And so
And you know that
if
there's
we
like,
were to
depending on like who's appraising your house, you can get pretty different estimates based on
yeah,
just
well, not just yeah, you might be appraised a certain value but not get it, as well. Like, the housing market might just be different depending on the time. And so, if you have a family-owned business, a farm, 3 cars, a house, and I don't know, a 401k with $200,000 in it, um, what are you worth? How much wealth do you have? These are hard questions to answer because you have to individually say, okay, well, the 401k is easy because that's stocks and bonds and it's a dollar value. So that's easy enough. Well, the house, I mean, how much is the house worth? Well, what's the market doing for a house? How much are the houses in his neighborhoods going for? Is his house similar to the other houses in his neighborhood? How do you value a farm, right? What about the family business? It's a private business, it's not publicly traded. It's really hard to value, right? And so
same with the
that
cars for the same reasons. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. But I guess, basically though, income is just what you're paid and the sort of distribution you get every year in terms of money. and wealth is like the accumulation of assets and capital you have over time. So the money in your bank account, the cars and houses you own, the businesses you own, all that stuff.
Okay, that kind of fit my intuitive grasp of it. I couldn't have said that, but yeah, that tracks.
Yeah. This is where people will say like sometimes you'll see headlines like Mark Zuckerberg lost $9 billion today, because of some PR fiasco he's going through, right? Well, he didn't actually lose $9 billion. What they're saying is that all the stock that he owns in Facebook decreased in value by $9 billion. Now, a year later, you don't see a headline that says Mark Zuckerberg made $20 billion. Well, because he didn't. It's just the stock that he already owned increased in value. So his wealth is decreasing and increasing, but the money he has on his person is relatively static.
So if I were to explain this to myself in terms of Beanie Babies, as the '90s kid I am, at one point I had 100 Beanie Babies, and I was sitting on a pile of gold. I couldn't trade those in. I couldn't trade them into the store for cash, but they were worth a lot of money, or I was told they were worth a lot of money. And then one day the Beanie Baby bubble burst, and now all of a sudden I have a bunch of worthless stuffed animals. So my wealth would have gone down.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's like if, for instance, if you own a house and say you have a job making 100 grand a year, right? And you own a house that's $250,000. When you bought it, it was $250,000, right? Um, your income, say the economy goes into a recession, a financial recession, like in 2008. You're, but say you don't get laid off, you're one of the lucky ones, right? Your income stays the same, right? 100 grand a year, but because the value of your house decreases, your wealth will decrease, right? So the value of your house goes from 250 to 200. You're still making 100 grand a year, and you're still able to go out to eat and support your family and stuff. But if we were to take an accountant and determine what your net wealth was at that point in time, your wealth would go down. But your income stays the same.
Okay.
Yeah, and the implications are broader if you're if you're retiring, your wealth matters a lot more because you might liquidate a bunch of. When I say liquidate, I mean just sell them and turn them into cash. You might liquidate a bunch of assets, and all of a sudden you might be uh, out of luck because if the market is if like say all your wealth is based in real estate or something, and then all of a sudden real estate values are cut in half, it's like, oh man, maybe I can't retire when I thought I could because I was hoping I'd be able to sell all this property and have a big old pile of money that'll last me until I die, right? So it can be a precarious thing retiring.
Yeah, see, I think one of the problems is like I've never looked at money or wealth beyond like, okay, what kind of stuff can I buy? What can I buy right now? And that's how I've judged like my own financial well-being and the financial well-being of my friends and all that stuff. Is like, can I buy one video game if I go out to the store right now, or more than one video game? And it's never really evolved beyond that. Like it feels weird because I'm 31 now, so I have adult friends who like trade stocks and own house and talk about they talk about like the equity of their cars and stuff like that, and I've still never evolved beyond like the number that my bank account shows. I've still never evolved beyond that. I think it's almost a little bit like scary to me.
Yeah, honestly, for a lot of people in your situation, I've actually considered diving not just into economics. So I'm educated in finance as well, just trying to do more like almost like educational finance videos because there are a lot of people in your circumstance where like I was lucky because my grandma who raised me was super duper anal about money, like very very much understood exactly how poor she was and like all the money coming in and out and where it was going and the productive uses of it. And that's why she retired making it was a very bizarre situation. So she retired actually making like I'm trying to think of the percentages. She retired making like 60-70% more in retirement than when she was working. To which of course my question to my grandma was, Grandma, if you make more if you can do the numbers and you make more in retirement, why don't you just retire now? Like, why would you even keep working? Like one thing she told me was she was gonna take she'd worked for the same company for like almost 40 years, so she had a lot of vacation, and so she said she was gonna take 6 weeks of vacation on January 1st and then retire right after her vacation was over. I was like, well, grandma, again, why would you if you can make 60-70% more, why would you take less pay for 6 weeks when you could just retire at the end of the year? And she said, "Oh, I just want to fuck them over. I don't like my employer, so I just want them to pay me to do nothing for 6 weeks, and then I'm going to retire." And I was like, "Okay, well,
Queen shit.
that's reasonable." It's not always perfectly financial, advice or anything, but that's how she was. But that's what kind of rubbed off on me, and some people don't. That's why a lot of people say like, oh, you should learn about how to do taxes in school, and you should have to learn how to balance a checkbook or whatever when you're in school. And I think that's right to a certain extent. Like people should, there should be some financial literacy and
I do
basic
think it's not
education.
enough to assume that like your parents are going to teach you. So my dad was of the
Yeah.
opinion that money is paper, and then we got our trailer repossessed, and then moved into an apartment in which the only thing on my parents' mind is like we got to come up with $400 every month, and that was the extent of like their financial knowledge. So
Yeah.
yeah, it would have been nice to have like some sort of formal education uh, on financial matters.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it can help a lot of people, and because it's a big problem in the lower income community. Actually, I was looking into starting a charity, and the charity was basically going to be free financial lectures for lower income people, like basic stuff, like what's a credit score, how does getting a homework, what how does how to understand managing your finances, like what can you afford and not afford, stuff like that, because you do see almost like poverty traps where people will get into these crazy situations where like they'll take out a payday loan, and it's like payday loans are so terrible for people. It
Yeah.
is it is literally better to just not pay your bills than to take out a payday loan. Like never ever under any circumstance take out a payday loan, right? And this is the type of advice that I was considering offering. But interestingly enough, when I was literally at the point of registering, because I was serious. I was at the point of registering with the IRS, the charity. They told me financial advice is not considered charitable giving. That you
Ah,
can register as a nonprofit, but the tax distinguisher of a nonprofit versus a charity is that if someone donates me money for like lecture materials or like traveling, like if I traveled to different cities or something like that, a charity would mean that those donations are tax deductible. That if I donate to like Econoboy's charity, I can deduct those donations from my taxes. But a nonprofit is just a nonprofit. I can give to a nonprofit, but I'm not tax deductible on those donations, which I thought was crazy. I was like, man, there must be some reason. Maybe people were scamming the system, and it's like I'm giving financial advice, and I'm just really running a fraudulent charity. but, um, but damn, that was frustrating because it's definitely an area that a lot of people could benefit from. Because, like I said, the only reason you'd ever go to a pawn shop or a payday loan place is if like you just don't understand that they're scamming you. Like it's an educational gap purely.
something I've looked up, not in it tangentially related to economics, but mostly just has to do with like uh, when you grow up really, really poor, it messes with your sense of time and perspective. Like because the only thing that matters is the short term. Like so it doesn't matter if this is gonna fuck me over in the future. My power is gonna be turned off tomorrow. I gotta pay this bill now, or I will not have something tomorrow, or I'm going to take these smaller quantities of food, even though they're more expensive, per unit, because I just literally cannot afford, doing the more cost-effective
Like
measure.
buying in bulk, yeah.
Yeah, there's no buying in bulk because buying in bulk is more expensive at the point of purchase than buying individual units. And if you have $35 in your bank account and you have to have food for the week, well, you have to do you have to do the less financially viable thing because it's the only viable thing.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I think, but at the same time, whilst that's true, there's also a lot of actually people don't realize there's a lot of negotiating leverage when it comes to that kind of thing. Not that you can go to Walmart and like argue with the people. Sometimes try to do that shit, which is really annoying for retail workers. Like, oh, I don't want to pay $10 for this whatever package of steak. I want to pay $5. It's like, dude, I'm just the cashier. Like, it's not that, but um, if you're, for instance, if you're not able to make like your rental payments or your mortgage payments, um it's better to reach out to the property management company or the mortgage servicer because they don't want to kick you out. Like the worst case scenario for a mortgage servicer or a property manager is this person cannot pay their rent or their mortgage, and that is a persistent issue and we will now have to kick them out because it's a regulatory nightmare, and it's also just bad for business. Obviously they'd prefer you to pay some of your rent than none of it. I mean, they don't want to have to go through the hell of kicking you out. And so it's like in scenarios like that, it's like, oh, I had to get this payday loan because I was about to miss a rental payment. It's like, dude, just talk to your property manager and they'll probably work something out with you. Like it's like 99% of cases they're going to be able to work something out with you. Same thing with your mortgage servicer. Like it's a surprisingly flexible thing in a lot of these things. Like if you're missing a car payment, they're not going to repossess your car the next day, right? Now they're going to ding your credit. It's not going to be good, right? But it's way better than getting in this 20,000% payday loan nonsense. And so little financial advice like that. Like I think that an hour long lecture to like lower income communities about basic finance, I think would help so many people. And similarly, like in your situation, my grandma, she took the opposite route where it was like, she was very poor her whole entire life, literally until she retired. Like she went from like lower income to like call it lower middle class when she retired, right? And she lives a Spartan enough lifestyle that she's able to afford, whatever she wants because she's not a very extravagant person, right? And so, um, her situation was like, I need to earn this money today for this thing, but also at the same time, I need to save for retirement. I need to do some investing, no matter how hard it hurts. I need to be able to do that. And I didn't even have the strength to do that when I was in school. When I was in college, I actually struggled. I struggled financially the most actually when I was in grad school,
Hmm.
because when I was in undergrad, I got enough need-based financial aid to pay for my undergrad, whereas in grad school, at least in America, I mean, you're basically on your own. Like you're hoping for federal loans, but those are still loans, right? And there's not as much. Like for instance, I would get so much aid that I would get more grants than I actually had in tuition. So every semester, I would get $2,000 or $3,000 that would help me pay for the bills and pay for food and stuff. Um, that wasn't a thing in graduate school. So even like when I was making 25, 30 grand a year or something like that in grad school, it was like, man, this just sucks. This is awful. I've been poor before, but this is like a particularly tight
Yeah,
environment.
so when I went to grad school, it's like I was able to get a graduate assistantship, which means like my tuition was paid for and I got a stipend, but the stipend was like $1,000 a month,
That's nothing. Yeah.
which is would not have covered rent. I could not have gone to grad. I could not have afforded to go to grad school if I wasn't married. If I didn't have a partner who was helping with, helping me with finances. So it was very. It wasn't a great situation, and it just so happened that I graduated grad school in the midst of COVID. So even if I wanted to go back to being a personal trainer, not a whole lot of not a whole lot of options there, right?
Yeah.
So
Pandemic.
yeah, a little bit, just a teensy bit of a pandemic, and turns out like spending time around people who are grunting out forcefully, not the safest place to be. So,
I was talking to the provost of my university, and we were advocating for higher stipends for graduate students, and especially for international students, because what I was talking to this lady who is a doctorate student in one of the schools at my university, and her stipend was $600 a month.
mm-hmm,
Now, naturally, you might just say, well, If you're making $600 a month, that is obviously not enough to live on. But I mean, yes, being a doctor, a graduate assistant, a lot of hours. But at the end of the day, if you need to get a second job, you get a second job, right? Um, but she was an international student. So she literally was legally not allowed to work anywhere else besides for the school. And my the question I asked the provost was, what is she supposed to do? Right? Because
Start a
she,
Twitch channel.
well, yeah, it is illegal for her to earn any other income in this country besides what you pay her. So I mean, outside of selling drugs, I don't know what she's supposed to do. That was the exact phrase that I used. Was like literally besides doing something illegal like selling drugs, um what can she do for money, right? Cuz some, a lot of these grad students are they just make so little money, and you're doing so much work as a PhD student, you know, for that $5 to $1,200 a month in so many cases.
Yeah, it was a fun experience. I feel like if I was doing it on my own, it would have been undoable. I would have quit like a week into it. So yeah,
Yeah,
so I was,
that's tough.
yeah, I got well. Oh, it wasn't tough for me because I was lucky to have a partner who had as a decent job and was able to like push us through. I couldn't order, another instrument every other month like I was when I was actually like I had two real jobs. Couldn't do that anymore. But it was it had enough to get by. Uh, this got me thinking like because I just got this email today and I have a feeling it's going to be relevant to a lot of people. So student loan payments are starting up here in a month and a half for a lot of people, and I know a lot of people are going to be hurting a lot more than they were. So if they, even if you didn't take a giant hit to your employment or anything like that, but especially if you did, a lot of people are gonna feel these student loan payments after they start up on January 31st of next year, and just like what you were saying, like in the email I got from my student loan provider, they say, hey, here are your options: 4 steps to prepare for to restart payments, and they give you options like review your repayment plan, consider an income-driven repayments to like maybe even reduce it down to like zero. So they want you to be aware of these options. I don't think they want you to say, just like what you were, how you were putting it. I don't think they want you to put it all on your, well, they might not care, but it's probably not in your best interest to like shift it to a credit card or take out a loan or take out another loan to pay off your loan or anything like that. So I don't know if you know a lot about like student loan repayments, but what kind of advice would you give to someone who is worried that they're not going to be able to afford their expenses once these student loan repayments start back up?
Yeah, I think interestingly, so I talked about starting a charity earlier. So I was really, really again nearly pulled the trigger on starting a charity regarding student loan forgiveness. So interestingly, there's a secondary market for debt. Um, and what I mean by that is, so for instance, if you buy a new like Ford pickup truck, um, that is I don't know if it's literally called a primary market, but like you're buying it new, right? A secondary market would be selling the used version of that pickup truck. So the secondary market for vehicles is the used market. The secondary market for debt is debt that has been sold to someone else,
Mm-hmm.
right? That you originated the loan, you gave the loan to the person, but for one reason or another, you've sold it to someone else because you just don't want to deal with collecting on it. And I wanted to start a charity that would actually buy that debt and forgive it. What I found was that interestingly, the IRS also did not consider student loans as like, so when you're starting a charity, you have to demonstrate that the charitable giving that you're giving to people is necessary, right? Like you can't start a charity that says, I'm going to give people private jets because that's not like, you don't need a private jet, right? Generally. And when it comes to student loan forgiveness, the argument is that, well, you didn't have to get student loans, right? You don't have to go to college, right? And it's not as necessary as like you can start a charity to forgive medical debt, because you have to go, if you've got medical debts because you had to, you didn't have a choice, right?
Yeah.
You were financially constrained and you had a medical issue. What are you going to do? Um, but no, there was no life or death situation to get an education, which I think is ridiculous, but that's how they defined it. This led to a conversation. It's a long way to answer your question. This led to a conversation with uh, there was a lawyer he labeled himself as he specialized in debt forgiveness cases, right? Student loan debt, and I was like, oh, great. Um, One of the biggest problems is procuring debt, right? How do I buy this debt? It's kind of a shady market because you have to kind of know a guy, and he was very unhelpful because he was an asshole. But uh, because I asked him, I was like, how do people sell debt? And he's like, I wasn't led to believe that's what this conversation was about. I'm like, well, actually, I did email you that this was what the conversation was about. But what he said he would encourage people to do, and I'm not encouraging people to do this because honestly, I don't know if I don't think it's really a good idea based on what I understand of student loans. What he would do is basically tell people, "Oh, just default on your student loans. Just don't pay them." Because the idea is that because people are willing to purchase debt on a secondary market, um, they will forgive the balance of your debt, some percentage of your debt balance if you do that. So what I mean by that is, say that I have a student loan that I'm refusing to pay. I'm just like, fuck you. I don't care about what happens to my credit. I'm not paying it. You know, get off my back, right? Because you can't repossess a college degree. I mean, you've got the degree. They can't take the degree from you, right? They can't like say you're not a doctor anymore because you don't want to pay your medical student loan debt, right? Um, that's just how. Luckily, that's how it works, you know. And um, so what'll happen is they're gonna be on your ass about paying it, and they're gonna hit. It's gonna destroy your credit most likely. Um, but if you're active enough with it, they will eventually say, "Oh, okay. Well, how about this? You owe us 10 grand. If you give us 5 grand today, we'll call it even Stevens, right? We'll just say you've paid off the balance of your debt, right?" Um, that's the advice he gave. I am hesitant to give that advice because there are income based repayments, right? And to me, your credit history follows you for 7 years, right? So if you think in the next 7 years you're going to want to buy a car, finance a car, you're going to want to buy a house. You're going to want to have a bigger limit on your credit card if you for like emergencies, something like that. If you're going to want to go back to school, maybe even and get, maybe perhaps take out another student loan. I don't know. Um, you're not going to want to have that on your credit history because it's harmful for your ability to get credit in the future, even for things that are good debt like a mortgage. A mortgage is a good debt to have because it's collateralized. Usually when you get a mortgage you have equity immediately. So like what I mean by that is if you take out a mortgage, the value of your house is normally immediately more than your mortgage payment because you put a down payment in and you're paying a monthly principal payment. So say that I took out a loan for a $200,000 house, and let's say it's, I have $180,000 loan because I put 20,000 down. Well, the value of my home is $200,000. I owe $180,000 on that loan. So in theory, the worst case scenario, I have no ability to pay my mortgage. I'm going to sell my house for $200,000 and pay off the loan, and I'll have $20,000 left. That $20,000 is my equity. Um, and with student loans, it's not the same, right? And if you default on those loans, you're going to have a hard time getting even good credit, like I said, like a mortgage. Functional credit, like a car, is going to be, you're going to have a higher rate on your car, which increases the cost of your monthly payments. And you're going to have a harder time getting a big credit card balance. Like if you want a $5,000 credit limit for emergencies, that's going to be hard to get if um, if you've got this 7 year long history of a notch that says, oh, I refuse to pay my student loans and I defaulted on them. So my advice wouldn't necessarily be that. It would be probably just taking advantage of the income based repayment and going from there, doing minimum payments, and any extra money you have, just pay off the highest interest loans first. That's what I do. That's what like the standard sort of valuation, whatever, like financial advice is going to be is just pay off the highest value ones first. My wife does another method is when you pay off the lowest balance student loans first. So like the idea is like if I took out a loan for 1,000, another loan for 5,000, and another loan for 10,000, which is maybe a standard thing for especially
Mhm.
federal student loans. Um, some people feel like it is more satisfying to pay off the lowest balance ones first, because it's like you've accomplished something. Um, if you want to save the most money, though, pay off whichever ones have the highest interest rate. So make the minimum payments that you have to, and then any extra money you have, pay off student loans. I think something to keep in mind, especially with student loans, is that the interest on student loans compounds daily. Every day it compounds. Now, what that means is, um, if you have an interest rate of 10%, let's say that's an insane interest rate, but let's just go with it, right?
Every single
Um,
day, 10% of what's there is
well,
yeah.
no,
What?
it's it's a it's a daily interest rate. So it's always annualized. So if your interest rate is 10%, that's an annualized rate. Um, so every day it's 10% divided by 365 as a percentage adds to your balance of your loan. And that doesn't maybe sound like a lot, but my own mom, for instance, I was trying to convince her, and eventually did convince her that like you have to take your student loans more seriously. I did the math for her. Every single day, her student before she paid any money in her student loans, if she just made the minimum interest payments every single day, her loan adds $13 to itself because it compounds on itself,
So,
right?
hold on, explain that
Um,
one more time. So, if you have an interest rate of 10%, they say 365 divided by 10, or the other way around.
well, it's 10% divided by 365,
Okay,
yeah,
so
or like
10
whatever the compounding would
by
be, yeah. So
365, 10% divided by
it's like,
365, added every day.
yeah, it's like if, for instance, if it adds to the principal. So like, say you took say you had a 2% gain. Say you had $10, right? Or say $100, and it gained 2% in value the next year. Well, now you've got $102, right?
Mhm.
Um, let's say the following year it also gained 2%. Well, your gain isn't going to be $2. It's going to be a little bit more than $2 because
Right.
instead of 2% of $100, it's
2% of
2% of
102.
$102. Exactly. That's basically what's happening with student loans, where the interest is compounding, quote unquote, where every day that you don't make more than just the minimum payment, the interest, the balance that you owe stays the same if you make a minimum payment. If you don't make any payments at all, the balance that you owe on a student loan is actually going to go up because it's compounding every single day. So for my mom, for instance, $13 a day, she would have to pay $390 a month just for her balance to stay the same. That's how crazy student loan interest is. So before you even make a dent in terms of what you actually owe the bank, you have to pay $390 a month if you're my mom, right?
Yeah.
Um, Now the trade-off to that is that if you make aggressive payments, your balance is going to go down and your minimum payment's also going to go down, right? Because if you've got $10,000, your monthly payment's going to be less than if it was $30,000, right? And so um, that's why I would focus, especially if you've got only like 5% of student loans are private. Most of them are federal government student loans. If you have student loans that are private, you're looking at student loan interest that is like 10%, which is a crazily high interest rate for a daily compounded interest. So just keep that in mind. That's what my advice would be: is make the minimum payments, and then anything you have in your bank beyond that, just send it straight to student loans. That's what I did. I didn't even start saving for retirement until I was 25 years old, because um basically, if you think about it, if I have a 6% interest rate on my student loan, that's kind of an opportunity cost, right? So I can guarantee that I won't have to pay 6% interest later versus putting my money in a retirement market account and getting maybe a 10% return. Now, for me, it was just worth it to to pay off my student loans and get them out of the way because I didn't want to have that 6%, compounded interest, hitting me every single, every single
Every
day.
single day.
Um, yeah, it's pretty tough.
A lot more to it than just keeping money in your mattress, is what I'm learning.
Yeah, yeah. Student loans are really tough. I mean, I've always been a proponent of, getting uh, what do you call it? Some sort of a student loan forgiveness, like income based student loan forgiveness, where like lower income people just have their loans forgiven. I mean, it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't make sense for me if you're, you know, because it's almost like you're punishing people for getting educated, and that shouldn't. You shouldn't have any sort of a financial disincentive to get educated. It's good for all of society is made better when we become more educated. So that should be not really a problem.
Fantastic. Yeah, I have those tabs pulled up like right now to go over after we're done. So I'm gonna talk to my husband and see like what's gonna happen here
Oh,
next.
your student loans?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, does your husband have student loans?
Yep.
Goodness, man.
Good.
Everyone's
Yeah, both of us have student loans. He went to law school for a
everyone's got
year
student
and a
loans.
half. A year and a half. Didn't finish, but Jesus, the amount of loans that he had to take out to go to law school for a year and a half were
Yeah.
enormous. Like
That's what happens when you see people who like you hear about these insane stories where like they're taking student loan payments out of my social security checks.
jeez.
That's usually that'll normally be. It's like, oh, I went to medical school for 3 out of the 4 years, but for one reason or another I didn't finish, and so I've got like $200,000 in student loans, but I'm not making a doctor's salary. So
Yeah.
it's like, oh shit.
It's like
You
if
know,
you go to one of
it's
those expensive if you go to med school or go to law school, and it turns out that you didn't make the correct decision in terms of like, so after like a year and a half he realized, oh, if I become a lawyer, I will jump off a bridge immediately. I hate every second of my time here in law school. It was because you don't know until you get there, right? You don't know how like what the ins and
yeah,
outs of being a
the
lawyer are.
environment.
Yeah, you don't know what the environment is. You don't know exactly what your job is going to entail before you make the jump and see what it's going to be like. And so you're almost punished for trying with enormous back-breaking loans.
Yeah. No, that's. I mean, I understand when people like. I had a debate with Kaio-san about this actually, and I get it when people say, if we made law school and medical school free, these are high paying positions, right? It's almost like a giveaway to the upper class, and it's like, okay, well, number one, that's kind of true, but also number two, it's not a bad thing to become a doctor, right? Like that's a good thing, right? We should encourage that to happen. Um, and also, we have a progressive tax system, right? I mean, if someone's making $500,000 a year, they're paying a proportionally higher amount of taxes than someone making $100,000 a year or $20,000 a year. And so, I get it. Like if you're giving a free education to someone who's going to turn around and make 300 grand a year, I can understand why people would be hesitant to do that. But the free education's for everyone. Number one, in my view, and number two, any inequalities resulting in a higher salary from your education, um, you're going to be taxed more. So I mean, what's the big deal to give everyone this? The simplicity of a free education. That's how I feel about it. Because like you said, a lot of people, they'll go to these professional educations, pharmacy school, law school, dental school, medical school. You and me, I mean, we just did like regular old fucking academic grad school, and
mm-hmm.
that's already expensive enough. But professional educations are an order of magnitude
Yeah,
more
they're a
expensive,
whole
and
other beast.
yeah, and I just think you shouldn't be punished for even trying to get an education financially. I mean, if there's nothing wrong with that. And like you said, your husband supported you whilst you were in school. Obviously, your husband's a productive member of society. I mean, why should he be punished because he basically just felt like halfway through law school he didn't want to do it anymore? I mean, what's the skin off anyone's back, right? I mean, he took up a chair in a lecture that had 30 seats free anyway. I mean,
Yeah,
what's the big
what was
deal,
he?
right?
What was he like pulling away? What resources was he taking from someone else?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So we're on the same page there. It's pretty crazy.
So I've always been meaning to like try to rectify this enormous gap in my knowledge regarding economics, and a book that has been sitting in my bookshelf gathering dust that I've always meant to read next weekend. For the last 150 weekends, I've been meaning to read it next weekend. Is Capital by Thomas Piketty. You ever heard of that before?
Okay. Yes.
What do you think of it, and good place to is that a good place to go for someone who knows as little as I do?
As far as I'm aware, it's quite a good book. Like it's considered almost a transformatively good book. And I think I haven't actually read it. I know about it. I've read analyses of the book. But I think broadly it's considered an incredibly good book in general. So I mean, I think that's probably a fine recommendation. People have asked me. I am surprised to see the number of people who have asked me, "Do you know any books that I can read?" Because I didn't know people read books anymore. If I'm honest, right?
What Twitch channel should I
I don't.
watch?
Yeah, yeah. I don't read a lot of books personally. And I say that as I have read a lot of books, but I don't read a lot of
Truthfully,
books.
I
Right?
actually
Like,
don't read a whole lot of books either. I usually I read a lot of studies, but that's a lot
yeah.
different than reading giant long books.
No, same here. Yeah, I'm more of a study guy. I'm more of a lecture guy. I feel like I'm more of a visual learner, so maybe that's why. And like the graphs and studies and the obviously the lecture sort of component to me helps. I always tell people, if you want to learn about economics, I go for podcasts, debates, and lectures before anything else. So, if you ever have an economic topic that you're interested in, or honestly, really any, I mean, for God's sakes, how many professors have put out like their entire course catalog on Calculus 3? You could look up Calculus 3 lecture and you'll find like 30 different professors who have recorded every single lecture for their Calculus 3 semester, right?
So
Um,
are you saying not? And this is not a I'm not asking this in jest. There is enough quality information out there for free on places like YouTube or wherever podcasts are sold, that as long as you know how to filter what is reputable material, you can find a pretty quality background, a pretty quality base of economics knowledge for free on the internet.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, that's part of the project of channels like mine, for instance, is trying to to give economics sort of educational economic stuff in an entertaining fashion, but also that's fundamentally educational. And so there's a ton of stuff out there. It's really just, for instance, something that I did when I was learning when I was looking into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This was something I didn't know about, or like I knew the broad strokes of it
Yeah.
in general, but I didn't have a depth of knowledge in the issue. And um, when I was looking into that, I asked someone who seemed to be an authority on the topic, Eris,
Hmm.
aristocracy. I just sent her a Twitter DM and I was like, "Hey, uh, what, like, who are some reputable people that I can look toward in order to answer or sort of explain some of the foundations of this issue to me, right?" And that was helpful. She gave me, I think, one or two people that I could sort of Google and trust, and go from there. But yeah, economics is very similar. You can look up, the effects of whatever, tuition free college. You can look up what is Social Security, what are the effects of it. You can The Khan Academy has a whole rundown of Khan Academy style basic economics that you can look into for free, and all that stuff is very sort of, it's very uniform, modular, very helpful. The Economist magazine has its own YouTube channel, which I think they do a video about every other week about some sort of like modern economics issue, which is uh, I think good, especially if you want to have sort of contemporary conversations. Like I think they recently did a video about NFTs, for instance. Like, what
Ooh.
are NFTs? Like, what's even the big deal, right? And they did a video about ESG investing, so investing with sort of social goals in mind, not just profit. So, like, what is this, and how big a deal is it? That stuff. And the Financial Times has a podcast called Alpha Chat, which it's Alpha Chat Financial Times, and that podcast it's a really interesting podcast for a number of reasons. They've been doing that podcast every week for like 15 years. And the reason that's cool is because what I did, one of the first things I did when I heard of the podcast was I went back to their 2008 and 2009 podcasts, and I was like, oh, I wonder what they were saying in real time economically about this recession that they were currently experiencing. I was like 10 at the time. I didn't really grasp what was going on. Um, and something like that is, you can go back, for instance, I'm sure they did a whole series of podcasts during the COVID recession and all that stuff. So, and I'm sure they're doing podcasts right now. I listen to it whenever I have free time. I'm sure they're doing podcasts right now about like inflation and what the heck's going on with inflation and why is everyone making a big deal of it and what are the explainers. Those are some resources that I think are pretty good. I'm just to be truth be told, like you said, I'm really just not a big book guy. So
Okay.
people ask for
Absolutely
books,
fine.
and it's like,
It just feels like,
yeah,
oh, the books, that's like the pinnacle of knowledge. Like if you read a book out loud, or
nah,
if you read it out loud and turns it into a podcast, the information isn't good. But if you turn it into a book that you have to
I
read
guess. I mean,
by candlelight with a scotch in your hand, that makes it official.
I don't know if that were true, then going to school would just be checking out books and reading on your own. I guess, right? People need to. I learn best with a lecture with visuals, right? It seems, and that's how I learn best. So obviously, you can just replicate that at home. I mean, there's so much. There's so many people who are more like me than even I am. So like the idea of my channel is like education and entertainment as it relates to economics and politics. But like I still do debates and discussions. I still do stuff like this, where like the first half of this conversation we weren't at all talking about economics. And but there's a lot of channels out there that are more like almost purely focused on that educational aspect of economics, that people can benefit from. So
Outstanding. Got some good resources to look up.
there we go.
All right. Well, fantastic. I've had a lot of fun. I enjoyed this conversation quite a bit.
It's been great. I loved the first half and the second half. I think people will get a kick out of it and learn, hopefully learn them a little something for once in their lives.
Yeah, learn them a thing or two. Real good.
But no, it was great. I feel like I learned a lot, and it was great. It was great talking to you.
Yeah, I enjoyed this very much. If you ever, I don't know if our topics align all that much, but if there's ever a topic talking about the economics of trans affirmative healthcare, maybe we can team up.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'll stop the recording. The recording is stopped. You can go back to saying racial slurs now, and
well, you should have waited until I stopped my recording. So stop.